The deputy smirked at the federal markings on my truck and said, "Didn't expect someone like you hauling federal equipment." What he did not know was that every word, every instruction, and every attempt to push past the paperwork was quietly becoming evidence. My name is Nigel Osborne, and if you had driven into the Cedar Ridge Interstate Service Plaza that Tuesday afternoon, you would have seen exactly what everyone else saw: an ordinary black delivery driver climbing out of a dusty medium-duty cargo truck after nearly 6 hours behind the wheel. I wore faded work boots, dark jeans, a gray company polo, and a weathered navy baseball cap pulled low to keep the summer sun out of my eyes. Nothing about me stood out. That was exactly the point. The service plaza sat just off Interstate 75, one of those busy stops where families grabbed coffee, truckers stretched their legs, and travelers hurried through without paying much attention to anyone else. The fuel pump stayed busy almost every hour of the day, and the convenience store buzzed with people buying sandwiches, bottled water, and lottery tickets. I eased the truck beside the diesel pumps, shut off the engine, and stepped into the thick August heat. Before I even reached the fuel nozzle, I noticed a county patrol SUV rolling slowly through the parking lot instead of heading toward the highway. The vehicle wasn't responding to an emergency. It was cruising. The driver spotted me almost immediately. The SUV slowed even more before pulling into the lane beside my truck. Deputy Ricardo Rios climbed out first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. A second deputy, Sergeant Simon Taylor, followed him from the passenger side. Neither man greeted me. Neither asked how my day was going. Instead, they studied me in complete silence for several seconds before Ricardo looked from my face to the government contract decals displayed legally on the truck's door. His expression shifted into something between disbelief and amusement. "That's your truck?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I answered calmly. "Interesting," he replied while circling the vehicle. "Didn't expect someone like you hauling federal equipment." I ignored the comment and continued fueling the truck. Experience had taught me that arguing over vague remarks rarely accomplished anything. Simon stopped beside the cargo compartment and folded his arms. "Mind telling us exactly what's inside?" he asked. "The shipping paperwork is available if you need it," I replied. "I'd be happy to show you." Ricardo chuckled softly. "We'll decide what we need." Several nearby truck drivers had started glancing in our direction. A couple filling pickup trucks paused long enough to notice the conversation before pretending not to watch. The atmosphere changed in that familiar way public places sometimes do when strangers sense tension but don't know the reason behind it. Ricardo motioned toward the driver's door. "License, registration, delivery authorization." I handed over each document without hesitation. He barely glanced at them before passing everything to Simon, who flipped through the pages for only a few seconds. "These look expensive," Simon muttered while tapping the paperwork. "Government contracts usually don't end up with independent drivers. Our company specializes in secure logistics," I explained evenly. "We've handled federal transportation projects for years." Ricardo looked directly at me and smiled without warmth. "That's what they all say." He walked toward the rear cargo door and rested one hand against the locking mechanism. "Open it." "Am I being inspected under a specific regulation, deputy?" I asked politely. His eyes narrowed almost immediately. "You asking questions instead of following instructions?" "No, sir," I answered. "I'm simply asking which inspection this falls under, so I can make sure I follow the correct procedure." Simon laughed quietly. "Listen to this guy. Sounds like he memorized a handbook." A woman walking her golden retriever slowed for a moment before continuing toward the rest area. Two commercial drivers exchanged uneasy looks but stayed where they were. No one interrupted. No one stepped closer. Ricardo took one slow step toward me until we stood only a few feet apart. "Around here," he said, "we don't need permission to figure out whether someone's story adds up." I met his eyes without raising my voice. "I understand, deputy." He seemed almost disappointed by how calm I remained. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his radio crackled with static before falling silent again. Ricardo looked back at my truck, then at Simon, and quietly said something I wasn't supposed to hear. "Call dispatch. Something about this truck doesn't sit right." Simon stepped a few feet away and spoke into his radio in a low voice, while Ricardo continued walking slowly around my truck, studying every decal and every compartment as though he had already decided something was wrong. I stayed exactly where I was beside the fuel pump with my hands visible and my paperwork already in their possession. I had learned long ago that calm often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Ricardo finally looked back at me. "Who loaded this truck?" he asked. "Our logistics team at the regional distribution facility," I answered. "Do you have the shipping manager's name? It is listed on the transport documentation you are holding." He glanced down without bothering to read it. "I asked you." I repeated the name exactly as it appeared on the paperwork. He nodded slowly but offered no response. Instead, he walked toward one of the locked side compartments and tapped the metal door with his knuckles. "Open this one." Those compartments remain sealed unless there is a documented inspection or authorization from the contracting agency. I replied politely. Ricardo folded his arms. "Are you refusing?" "No, sir. I am asking for the appropriate inspection authority so I can comply correctly." Simon returned from the patrol vehicle wearing a faint smile that suggested dispatch had told him nothing useful. "Everything checks out so far," he admitted quietly to Ricardo, apparently believing I could not hear him. Ricardo frowned for only a moment before saying, "Then we check deeper." A retired couple fueling a recreational vehicle watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Across the parking lot, another commercial driver leaned against his cab with his phone lowered at his side, clearly paying attention without making a scene. The service plaza continued operating normally, yet a small circle of quiet observation had formed around us. Ricardo requested that I step away from the truck while he photographed the exterior from several angles. Every picture included the government contract markings, the license plates, and the identification numbers mounted near the cargo area. He photographed each document twice before handing them back to Simon instead of returning them to me. I noticed the time on the convenience store clock through the front window. Nearly 15 minutes had passed since I stopped for fuel. The delivery schedule still allowed enough flexibility, but the delay was becoming significant. Then something caught my attention. Simon casually referred to my shipment by a cargo classification that did not appear anywhere on the paperwork they had reviewed. It was a category used only within certain transportation databases. I did not react outwardly, but I stored the detail away immediately. That single sentence raised far more questions than either deputy realized. I quietly reached into my pocket. Ricardo watched my hand instantly. "Easy," he said. "What are you reaching for?" "My phone," I answered. "I would like to notify my dispatcher that there has been an unexpected delay." He hesitated before giving a short nod. "Make it quick." I unlocked the screen, opened what appeared to be an ordinary messaging application, and typed a brief update consisting of only a few words before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Neither deputy asked to read the message. Neither realized the application transmitted through an encrypted government network rather than a commercial service. Less than 10 seconds later, I locked the screen and activated the pre-configured field security mode, which concealed all operational applications and data. I then voluntarily handed the phone to Ricardo. "If you would like to hold it during the inspection, you may." He looked almost surprised by how easily I surrendered it. He turned the device over in his hand, expecting resistance that never came. Simon smirked. "Most people get nervous about that." "I have nothing to hide," I answered. Ricardo slipped the phone into his vest pocket and took another slow look at my truck before resting his hand once more on the cargo compartment latch. This time, instead of asking, he looked directly at Simon and quietly said, "Get the camera ready. We are opening this next." Simon retrieved a department-issued camera from the patrol vehicle while Ricardo remained beside the cargo compartment, his confidence growing with every passing minute. He looked less like someone conducting a routine inspection and more like someone expecting to uncover a dramatic discovery. I remained where he had instructed me to stand, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. The afternoon traffic continued flowing through the service plaza, but more people had begun noticing the unusual delay. A pair of long-haul drivers finished fueling their tractors, yet stayed parked nearby, quietly watching from a respectful distance. Ricardo held out his hand. "Give me the cargo key." "The cargo area is secured under federal transportation procedures," I answered evenly. "If you have legal authority to access it, I will comply once that authority is documented." His expression hardened. "You really like making simple things complicated." "I like following the contract requirements that govern the shipment." Simon stepped beside him and switched on the camera. Everything is being documented, he announced, directing the lens toward the rear of the truck. Ricardo nodded with satisfaction. Good. Nobody can say we did anything wrong. That sentence lingered in my mind. People who followed procedure rarely felt the need to announce it out loud. A few moments later, another county patrol vehicle entered the service plaza. Instead of stopping beside us, the deputy inside remained several parking spaces away, watching without leaving the driver's seat. Ricardo greeted him with a brief wave before turning back toward me. Dispatch confirmed you have no outstanding warrants, he said. Congratulations. I simply nodded. But paperwork can be forged, he continued. Decals can be copied. Trucks can be stolen. We are not finished. Around us, conversations at the fuel pumps grew quieter. The atmosphere had shifted from casual curiosity to careful observation. No one interfered, but everyone seemed to understand that something unusual was unfolding. Then Simon made an unexpected comment while reviewing one of the shipping documents again. This contractor has crossed through Rainbow County before. Ricardo looked at him. Is that the same route? Simon hesitated only briefly before answering. Looks similar. The exchange lasted barely 2 seconds, but it caught my attention immediately. Rainbow County. I had reviewed dozens of transportation complaints before accepting this assignment, and that county appeared repeatedly in reports filed by commercial drivers describing unexplained roadside delays. I kept my expression neutral, but another piece of the puzzle quietly slipped into place. Ricardo walked closer again. You seem awfully calm for someone being investigated. I have learned that staying calm usually helps everyone, I replied. He laughed once. Or maybe you know something we do not. I met his eyes. Maybe all of us will know more before today is over. For the first time, his smile disappeared completely. Simon glanced between us before clearing his throat and lowering the camera. Should I start the inventory log? He asked. Ricardo answered without looking away from me. Yes, we are documenting every compartment. He reached toward the locking mechanism again, then stopped when his portable radio produced a short burst of static. Dispatch was requesting a status update. Ricardo stepped a few feet away to answer, leaving Simon standing near the truck. Simon shifted his weight and quietly muttered to himself, apparently unaware I could hear him. If this goes like the last one, we will be done before dinner. My attention sharpened instantly. The last one. Those 4 words suggested this was not an isolated encounter, but part of an established pattern. Before I could consider what he meant, Ricardo returned, slipped the radio back onto his shoulder, and looked directly at Simon. Forget the inventory sheet, he said in a lower voice. Use the extended commercial contact packet instead. Simon walked back toward the patrol vehicle to retrieve the folder Ricardo had requested, leaving the 2 of us standing near the rear of my truck. Ricardo rested one hand lightly against the cargo door without attempting to open it. He studied me with growing curiosity, as though my calm response to every question had become more frustrating than any argument could have been. You still have not explained why someone driving a truck like this knows so much about inspection procedures, he said. Anyone who transports regulated freight learns the rules, I answered. Knowing the rules protects the shipment, the customer, and the officers conducting the inspection. He gave a skeptical smile. Most drivers just hand over the keys. Most drivers want to avoid misunderstandings, I replied. So do I. He looked away for a moment before scanning the parking lot. Several witnesses remained nearby, pretending to focus on their own business while quietly following every development. Ricardo seemed aware that more eyes were on him now than when the stop had begun, yet he appeared determined to continue. Simon returned carrying a thick incident packet and handed it over. Ricardo flipped through several pages before stopping at a blank report form. I noticed the heading immediately. It was intended for documenting unusually sensitive incidents rather than routine roadside inspections. That choice alone struck me as unusual because nothing about my shipment had justified moving into that category. I remained silent. Sometimes people revealed more when they believed nobody recognized the significance of what they were doing. Ricardo looked up from the paperwork. Tell me something, Nigel. How often do you come through Cedar Ridge? Whenever my assigned route requires it. And before this job, I have driven through many counties over the years. He nodded slowly, then asked, have you ever been stopped by Rainbow County deputies? The question landed with unexpected precision. Until that moment, I had never mentioned Rainbow County, yet he brought it up naturally. almost as though he expected a familiar answer. I paused just long enough to study his expression before replying. Why do you ask about Rainbow County specifically? Ricardo realized he had revealed more than intended. Just making conversation, he answered. Interesting choice of conversation, I said quietly. His jaw tightened, but he moved on without responding. Inside my mind, the timeline I had spent months assembling grew a little clearer. Complaints filed by commercial drivers from different counties had described similar language, similar delays, and similar inspection tactics. Individually, none of those reports proved misconduct. Together, they suggested a pattern that deserved closer attention. Today's encounter was beginning to resemble those earlier accounts with remarkable consistency. Simon interrupted my thoughts by pointing toward one of the security cameras mounted beneath the service plaza canopy. That camera probably does not even work, he said with a shrug. Ricardo glanced up briefly and dismissed it. Does not matter. I noticed both deputies relax after making that assumption, apparently believing the only recordings would come from their own equipment. Neither of them asked whether commercial vehicles sometimes carried their own security systems. Neither of them looked closely enough to notice the small weatherproof lenses integrated into the truck's exterior. Every conversation since the fuel pump had been activated was already preserved from multiple angles with synchronized audio, operating exactly as the fleet's security policy required. I showed no reaction because there was no reason to. Ricardo closed the incident packet and looked directly at me once again. One last question before we continue, he said. Why did you choose this route today? I answered truthfully without adding another word. Because it was assigned to me. He held my gaze for several seconds, then quietly replied, almost to himself, no, I think you came here for a reason. At that exact moment, a dark sport utility vehicle exited the interstate and slowly turned into the service plaza, parking several rows away without activating emergency lights or drawing unnecessary attention. The dark sport utility vehicle came to a smooth stop several rows away, followed less than 15 seconds later by a second vehicle of the same color. Neither carried flashing emergency lights. Neither parked dramatically. To everyone else at the service plaza, they looked like ordinary government vehicles arriving for a routine meeting. Ricardo barely glanced in their direction before returning his attention to me. Looks like you are still waiting on an answer, he said. I am waiting for the inspection to follow the appropriate procedure, I replied. He gave a short laugh. You really think procedure is going to save you? Before I could respond, the doors of the first vehicle opened. 3 professionally dressed men and 1 woman stepped out wearing business attire instead of tactical gear. They walked across the parking lot at an unhurried pace, carrying slim document cases rather than equipment bags. None of them acknowledged the deputies immediately. Their calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing tension surrounding my truck. Simon noticed them next. Do you know those people? He quietly asked Ricardo. Ricardo shook his head. Probably inspectors from the transportation department. The group continued walking until they reached the edge of the fuel island. The woman briefly surveyed the scene, taking in the patrol vehicles, the gathering witnesses, the open incident packet in Ricardo's hand, and finally me. She gave an almost imperceptible nod before stopping several feet away. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Even the nearby conversations seemed to fade beneath the steady hum of diesel engines and passing traffic. Then the tallest man in the group addressed me in a calm, professional voice. Good afternoon, Lead Investigator Osborne. Has today's observation phase concluded? Every sound around us seemed to disappear. Ricardo stared at the man as though he had misheard him. Simon looked from the visitor to me and then back again, waiting for someone to laugh and explain that it was all a misunderstanding. No one did. I reached up, removed my weathered baseball cap, and slipped it into the back pocket of my dark jeans. The observation phase has produced substantial material, I answered evenly. The encounter is still in progress. The woman stepped forward and presented a federal credential case to Ricardo without raising her voice. Special Agent Veronica Sutton, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the next few minutes, please leave the truck, patrol vehicles, documents, and recording equipment exactly where they are while we coordinate with County Command. Witnesses are not being detained and will be free to leave after we obtain voluntary contact information. Ricardo accepted the credential almost automatically, his confident expression replaced by visible confusion. He looked at the identification once, then a second time, before slowly lifting his eyes toward me. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he repeated quietly. That is correct, Veronica answered. Simon instinctively reached toward the phone that Ricardo had placed in his vest pocket earlier. Ricardo removed it immediately and handed it back to me without being asked. Your property, he said, his voice noticeably different from before. I accepted the phone with a polite nod. Thank you, Deputy. One of the federal agents turned toward the witnesses gathered around the fuel pumps. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. If any of you observed today's interaction and are willing to provide a voluntary statement later, we would appreciate your assistance. You are free to continue with your travel plans. Several truck drivers exchanged surprised looks. The retired couple near the recreational vehicle quietly remained where they were, clearly realizing they had witnessed something much larger than an ordinary roadside inspection. Ricardo finally found his voice again. Nobody informed us this was a federal operation. I looked directly at him before answering. They were not supposed to. The truck, route, contractor markings, and cargo had all been authorized in advance as part of a controlled observation. The load contained only approved, non-sensitive test equipment, and I held the commercial license and operational training required to drive the vehicle legally. No classified material or active government shipment had been placed at risk. Veronica closed her credential case and calmly added, Deputy Rios, before we proceed any further, there is one question we need you to answer for the official record. Why did you select Mr. Osborne's truck before speaking with any other commercial driver at this service plaza today? For the first time since the encounter began, Ricardo did not answer immediately. He looked across the service plaza as though searching for an explanation that would somehow restore the confidence he had displayed only moments earlier. Instead, he found dozens of ordinary people continuing to watch from a respectful distance. Truck drivers stood beside their cabs. Families paused outside the convenience store. None of them interrupted, but every one of them had become an independent witness. Veronica Sutton waited patiently with a small notepad in her hand. Deputy Rios, she repeated in the same calm tone. What specific facts caused you to select Mr. Osborne's vehicle instead of the other commercial trucks that entered the fuel station this afternoon? Ricardo cleared his throat. It was a routine inspection. Veronica nodded once. Please describe the objective criteria that made this particular inspection routine. Ricardo glanced toward Simon before answering. The truck carried government markings. Veronica wrote down his response without comment. I quietly observed the exchange. Months of preparation had taught me that people often revealed more when they believed they were explaining themselves than when they felt accused. Simon shifted uneasily beside the patrol vehicle. There was nothing wrong with checking documents, he said. Commercial inspections happen every day. That is correct, I replied. Lawful inspections are an important part of public safety. Simon looked almost relieved until I continued. The question is whether today's inspection followed the same standards applied to every driver. The words settled over the group without hostility, but they carried enough weight to make everyone pause. Veronica turned another page in her notebook. Sergeant Taylor, did you review the transport documents before or after deciding additional inspection steps were necessary? Simon hesitated. Before. Did those documents contain any violation? No. Did dispatch report any warrant, stolen vehicle alert, or active criminal investigation involving Mr. Osborne? No. Veronica thanked him and simply wrote another line. No raised voice. No dramatic confrontation. Only careful questions answered one at a time. Halfway through the conversation, another federal agent approached me carrying a small tablet computer. He quietly said, Lead Investigator Osborne, the Fleet Security Office confirmed successful upload. I nodded once. Ricardo looked toward us immediately. Upload of what? The agent answered without emotion. The vehicle security recordings. Ricardo blinked. Recordings? Commercial security footage, the agent explained. Multiple synchronized exterior cameras that activate automatically whenever the vehicle is operating or stopped during contracted transport. Simon's face changed instantly. He slowly looked around the truck, finally noticing several small camera housings blended into the vehicle's safety equipment. Neither deputy said another word for several seconds. Veronica continued writing as though the information changed nothing. Those recordings will simply become one part of the complete evidentiary record, she said. They will be reviewed together with your body camera footage, dispatch recordings, service plaza surveillance, and any voluntary witness statements. The retired truck driver who had remained nearby quietly stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I have been parked over there since before these deputies arrived. If you need a statement, I would be glad to provide one." Veronica thanked him. Before she could respond further, two more commercial drivers walked over and volunteered to do the same. None of them appeared angry. They simply wanted the record to reflect exactly what they had seen. Ricardo watched the small group gathering near the fuel pumps, and for the first time his shoulders seemed to lose their earlier certainty. Just then, another federal agent exited the second sport utility vehicle carrying a sealed evidence envelope. He walked directly toward Veronica and quietly said, "The preliminary database comparison is complete." Veronica looked at the report, then slowly lifted her eyes toward Ricardo. "Deputy Rios," she said, "there is something in this file that you are going to want to explain." Veronica opened the sealed envelope slowly and removed several printed reports, carefully keeping them in order before speaking. "This file contains preliminary comparative material that will not be discussed in a public setting," she said. "It does not establish final conclusions. For now, our responsibility is to preserve today's evidence, identify witnesses independently, and coordinate formal interviews through county command." Ricardo stood silently while Simon looked toward the ground. Veronica continued, "During the past 18 months, your patrol area generated an unusually high number of discretionary commercial vehicle contacts involving government contractors. That fact alone proves nothing. However, the frequency becomes statistically unusual when compared with neighboring jurisdictions serving similar traffic volume." Ricardo finally spoke. "Statistics are not misconduct." "Correct," Veronica answered immediately. "Statistics are not misconduct. They are simply one reason investigators ask additional questions." I remained quiet because she was exactly right. Investigations were never built upon assumptions. They were built upon verified facts gathered one careful step at a time. One of the other agents placed a portable scanner on the hood of a federal vehicle and began cataloging copies of the paperwork that had been collected during the stop. Everything was logged with precise timestamps. Every document followed a documented chain of custody. The professionalism of the process changed the atmosphere completely. This was no longer an uncomfortable roadside encounter. It had become a structured federal inquiry. Then Veronica lifted another page from the file. Several commercial drivers independently described nearly identical conversations during prior traffic contacts. Similar wording. Similar requests for access to secured cargo. Similar explanations that no specific violation could be identified. Simon looked surprised. "People complain all the time." "Yes," Veronica replied. "Most complaints do not survive preliminary review. These did." Her answer hung in the air for several seconds. A truck driver who had volunteered to provide a witness statement quietly shook his head. "I remember hearing stories at distribution centers," he said. "Nobody could ever prove what happened because every stop looked ordinary by itself." Veronica thanked him but did not ask another question in public. She simply noted his willingness to cooperate. That restraint reminded everyone present that professional investigations were not conducted through arguments in parking lots. They were conducted through documented evidence collected over time. I glanced across the service plaza and noticed another familiar detail. The convenience store manager had walked outside carrying a small folder. He approached one of the federal agents and said, "Our security system stores high-definition video for 30 days. I can place an immediate preservation lock on today's recordings so they cannot be altered, deleted, or lost during the normal retention cycle." The agent accepted the information with appreciation. Ricardo's expression changed again. Until that moment, he had likely assumed only the patrol body cameras and my truck's security system documented the encounter. Now an additional independent source would preserve the complete timeline from another angle. Veronica closed the report and looked directly at Ricardo once more. "Deputy Rios, this review is not limited to today. We will compare today's recordings with prior reports, dispatch records, body camera files, and department documentation. Every piece will either support or contradict the others." Ricardo took a slow breath before asking quietly, "What happens now?" "Now," Veronica answered, "the evidence determines what happens next, not opinions." Before anyone could say another word, One of the federal agents received a notification through his secure tablet. He reviewed the message twice, then walked directly toward me. "Lead Investigator Osborne," he said in a measured voice. "Headquarters has completed the cross-reference search." I studied his expression carefully. He rarely showed emotion during field operations. This time, however, there was unmistakable seriousness in his eyes. He lowered his voice just enough that only those standing nearby could hear. "The review identified one name that appears throughout multiple jurisdictions, and it is not either deputy standing here today." The words settled over the group with unexpected weight. The name identified by headquarters belonged to neither Deputy Ricardo Rios nor Sergeant Simon Taylor. Instead, it belonged to a supervisory official whose signature appeared repeatedly on reports originating from several neighboring counties over the past 2 years. Veronica accepted the secure tablet from the agent and reviewed the summary without reading it aloud. After a few moments, she closed the cover and looked toward me. I understood immediately what she was thinking. The investigation had just expanded beyond the encounter at the service plaza. "We will verify everything before reaching any conclusions," she said. "Patterns deserve scrutiny. Facts determine outcomes." Ricardo seemed genuinely confused. "My supervisor?" he asked quietly. "You think this goes higher?" Veronica answered carefully. "We are not discussing conclusions in a public setting. We are acknowledging that additional review is warranted." That distinction mattered. Throughout my career, I had learned that responsible investigators never confused suspicion with proof. Every document still had to be authenticated. Every recording had to be reviewed. Every statement had to be compared against objective evidence. The process protected everyone involved, including the people under investigation. While the federal team continued documenting the scene, my phone vibrated softly. A secure notification confirmed that the encrypted message I had sent earlier had activated a preservation request for transportation records connected to my assigned route. That request had now been acknowledged by multiple agencies. It was a routine safeguard designed to prevent important documentation from being altered or accidentally discarded while a review was pending. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without comment. Nearby, the convenience store. Manager returned carrying a portable storage device prepared by the security contractor. "Everything from this afternoon has been copied," he told one of the agents. "Nothing will be overwritten." The agent thanked him and completed the chain of custody paperwork before accepting the device. Watching that exchange reminded everyone that preserving evidence was often as important as collecting it. Then something unexpected happened. An older man wearing a faded transportation company jacket slowly approached from the parking area where several commercial trucks remained parked. He introduced himself as Stephen Benson, a recently retired fleet supervisor. "I recognized Mr. Osborne the moment he pulled in," he said. Ricardo looked surprised. Stephen smiled gently. "Not because I knew he was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because I remembered speaking with him months ago during an industry safety meeting. He asked thoughtful questions about inspection consistency. He listened far more than he talked." Stephen paused before continuing. "Back then, I told him that good officers deserve clear procedures just as much as honest drivers do. Looks like he never forgot." I nodded respectfully. I did not. Ricardo listened quietly without interrupting. His expression no longer reflected certainty or frustration. Instead, it suggested that he was beginning to understand the investigation had never been about embarrassing individual officers. It was about determining whether public trust had been applied fairly and consistently. Veronica closed her notebook and addressed everyone gathered nearby. "We appreciate the professionalism shown by those willing to preserve evidence and provide factual statements. That cooperation strengthens the integrity of the process for everyone." Several witnesses nodded before gradually returning to their vehicles. The crowd slowly dissolved, leaving only the federal team, the deputies, and a few remaining truck drivers. Just as it seemed the afternoon was finally winding down, my phone rang again through the secure line. I glanced at the display, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself a brief look of surprise. The caller. Identification displayed the name of a retired sheriff whom I had contacted repeatedly during the investigation. The emergency preservation notice issued after today's encounter had reached his former department, and he had finally decided to respond. I answered the call, listened silently for several seconds, and then looked toward Veronica before saying only one sentence. He says he has been protecting the missing records all along, and he is ready to hand them over today. Veronica listened carefully as I finished the secure call, then nodded without hesitation. Within an hour, arrangements had been made for the retired sheriff to meet investigators at a federal field office instead of the service plaza. There was no dramatic arrest, no public confrontation, and no attempt to reach conclusions before the evidence had been thoroughly examined. That was never how responsible investigations worked. Before leaving, Veronica thanked every witness who had volunteered to provide a factual statement and reminded them that accuracy mattered far more than assumptions. Ricardo and Simon remained cooperative throughout the remainder of the documentation process. They answered additional procedural questions, provided the requested records, and acknowledged that the investigation would continue through the proper legal channels. As for me, I finally completed the fuel transaction that had been interrupted nearly 2 hours earlier. One of the truck drivers who had watched the entire encounter walked over as I replaced the fuel nozzle. He extended his hand and simply said, "Thank you for staying calm." I smiled and shook his hand. Calm makes it easier for the truth to be heard. He nodded thoughtfully before climbing back into his truck and continuing his route. Several weeks later, the investigation expanded into a comprehensive review involving multiple jurisdictions. Thousands of pages of records, dispatch logs, inspection reports, security recordings, and witness interviews were examined. Investigators also reviewed every extended commercial contact packet completed by the involved deputies during the review period. The completed review found that Ricardo and Simon had prolonged my detention without identifying an objective cargo violation, attempted to bypass documented inspection authority, and relied upon racial assumptions about who could legitimately transport federal freight. Comparative records also showed that black commercial drivers were subjected to discretionary cargo access demands at a substantially higher rate than similarly situated white drivers traveling through the same patrol areas. Both deputies were removed from commercial enforcement duties pending disciplinary proceedings and mandatory bias and procedure retraining. Some earlier complaints were found to have reasonable explanations supported by evidence. Others identified procedural deficiencies that required corrective action. Additional training standards were introduced for commercial vehicle contacts. Documentation requirements became more consistent across participating agencies, and oversight procedures were strengthened to improve transparency. The retired sheriff honored his promise and provided records that helped investigators understand how reporting practices had evolved over several years. Those documents filled important gaps without replacing the need for independent verification. Throughout the review, the focus remained on facts rather than headlines. Honest officers who had consistently followed department policy continued serving their communities with professionalism, while areas needing improvement received careful attention through established administrative processes. Months after that afternoon at the Cedar Ridge Interstate Service Plaza, I received a handwritten letter forwarded through official channels. The sender was a young deputy from another county who had followed the public reporting about the completed investigation. He wrote that watching experienced investigators remain patient, respectful, and committed to evidence had changed the way he approached every roadside encounter. He hoped that every driver who crossed his path would leave believing they had been treated fairly, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same notebook where I kept the earliest transportation complaints that had started this assignment. The first page reminded me why the investigation began. The last page reminded me why it mattered. As I climbed back into the driver's seat and guided the truck onto the interstate once more, the road ahead looked exactly as it had before, yet something important had changed. Trust had not been restored by one conversation or one investigation alone. It had grown through patience, documentation, accountability, and the willingness of ordinary people to tell the truth when it mattered most. Perhaps that is how lasting confidence is rebuilt, one careful decision at a time instead of one dramatic moment. There are times when the strongest response is not the loudest one, but the quiet determination to let facts speak with clarity. This story also reminds us that fairness becomes more meaningful when it protects everyone involved, including those asking difficult questions and those answering them. Sometimes the most lasting change begins with people who choose professionalism over pride, accuracy over assumption, and respect over anger. Those choices rarely attract immediate attention, yet they often leave the deepest mark long after the headlines have faded. Thank you for spending this journey with me. I would truly enjoy hearing your perspective after everything that happened. If you found yourself in Nigel's position, or even in the position of one of the witnesses who watched the entire encounter unfold, what choices would you have made, and what lesson will stay with you long after this story ends?